The study of the Vance estate smelled heavily of aged mahogany, imported tobacco, and the suffocating dry scent of burning paper. It was a room where human destinies were not gently guided, but calculated, liquidized, and traded like high-yield bonds. Diana stood rigid on the antique Persian rug, her spine forming a sharp line of flawless military posture that felt entirely hostile to the decadent plush velvet surroundings. In her hand, she held a thick, cream-colored envelope. The official seal of the Department of the Air Force was stamped in bold, unyielding blue wax across the back. It was an immediate commissioning directive and a full-ride leadership scholarship to the prestigious Air Force Command Academy. She had swept the national entrance exams, ranking first out of thousands. It was her golden ticket out of a psychological prison. "You look absolutely ridiculous holding that, Diana." A voice drifted coldly from the chaise lounge. Eleanor Vance did not look up from her financial ledger. She was a woman carved from white marble and generational Wall Street capital, her tailored Armani suit immaculate, her diamond rings clicking sharply against the crystal glass of her afternoon scotch. To Eleanor, human beings fell into two absolute columns: high-value assets and depreciating liabilities. For 18 years, Diana had been firmly logged into the latter. "It's a direct admission to the elite command track, Mother." Diana said, her voice quiet, but carrying the steady, resonant frequency of a pilot standing on a flight deck. "They only take 5 command candidates nationwide each cycle." Eleanor finally raised her eyes. They were a piercing, calculated ice gray, the exact hue of the storm clouds gathering outside the tall estate windows. She did not show a flicker of pride. Instead, her features hardened into a mask of pure aristocratic inconvenience. "A command track." Eleanor mimicked her lips curling into a sharp, venomous sneer. "Let me translate that into terms that actually possess economic value: a multi-year contract to be a glorified government technician, a measly federal stipend, and a guaranteed ticket to an early grave in some godforsaken desert. Tell me, Diana, how does that pay dividends to the Vance legacy?" "I am not looking to pay dividends to a corporate board," Diana said, tightening her grip on the envelope until the edges creaked. "I am looking to serve. I am looking to build a life that belongs to me." "You are looking to ruin our strategic positioning," Eleanor snapped, standing up with a fluid, predatory grace. She crossed the room, her high heels clicking like a countdown on the polished hardwood. She stopped mere inches from Diana, the heavy scent of her expensive French perfume clashing with the faint metallic tang of the rain outside. "You are a female, Diana. Let us not pretend you possess the administrative ruthlessness to navigate the upper echelons of global finance. Your only utility, your sole fiduciary purpose to this bloodline, was to secure the Wall Street merger with the Vanguard Group. Their youngest heir has been waiting for an alliance. Your marriage would have injected $50 million in liquidity into our international logistics division." "I am a human being, Mother, not a financial injection," Diana said, her jaw clenching so hard her teeth ached. "You are whatever I define you as until you provide measurable value," Eleanor countered coldly. Without warning, she reached out and snatched the acceptance portfolio out of Diana's hands. Before Diana could react, Eleanor turned and threw the entire bundle, the scholarship certificates, the commendation letters, the official military orders, directly into the roaring hearth fire. The flames hissed hungrily, swallowing the cream paper. The gold leaf letters began to blacken, charring into fragile gray ash within seconds. "Your sister Cassandra understands her worth," Eleanor said, watching the paper burn with an indifferent glaze over her eyes. "She is currently finishing her corporate law degree at Yale. She will take the chairing seat of the executive board by next spring. Every share, every property, and every cent of the Vance empire belongs to her because she knows how to look like an asset. You are an operational expense we are cutting." Eleanor sat back down, picking up her gold fountain pen without looking up again. Go play in your dirt, Diana. Go run around in camouflage. But remember this when you realize the world doesn't care about your little medals. Do not come crawling back to this house. You are officially stricken from the Vance books. Diana looked at the fireplace. The documents were gone, turned into an unrecognizable pile of glowing cinders. She looked back at her mother. There were no tears. The tears had been burned out of her years ago. I won't be coming back, Diana said softly. She turned on her heel and walked out, leaving the suffocating warmth of the Vance estate behind forever. The storm that night was not just a weather pattern. It felt like the physical universe reshaping itself around Diana's violent departure. It was the winter of 2021, and a vicious northeaster was burying the eastern seaboard under layers of blinding heavy snow. At 18, Diana walked into the recruitment depot with nothing but an old weathered canvas rucksack that had belonged to her grandfather, a retired combat engineer who was the only person in the family who had ever looked at her with genuine warmth. Her civilian clothes were exchanged for rough, oversized utility uniforms. Her hair was cropped close, and her identity was reduced to a set of dog tags and a serial number stamped onto standard issue gear. The transition from the absolute luxury of a billionaire's estate to the brutal, unfeeling machinery of the military aviation pipeline broke many of the wealthy recruits, but it only hardened Diana. She did not complain when the blistered skin on her feet bled into her heavy combat boots, nor did she flinch when the instructors threw her into the freezing mud of the survival courses. Vance! Senior! Master Sergeant Miller bellowed during a midnight survival drill, the wind howling through the pine trees of the northern training grounds. He stood over her as she dug a snow shelter with a small entrenching tool. You look like a rich girl who wandered off a golf course. Why the hell are you out here freezing when you could be sitting in a heated office in New York? Because the office in New York is a cage, Sergeant, Diana shouted back over the roar of the wind, her fingers stiff and numb within her damp gloves. She didn't stop digging. Her movements were rhythmic, driven by a deep internal engine of survival. The pipeline doesn't care about your family's money, Vance, Miller barked, leaning closer, his breath clouding in the sub-zero air. We've dropped 50% of the class already. When the night flight evaluations start next week, the darkness will swallow you whole if you have even a molecule of hesitation in your blood. Let the darkness try, sir, Diana said, looking up. Her eyes were completely steady, dark-focused and entirely devoid of the self-pity Miller was accustomed to seeing in washing out recruits. Miller stared at her for a long beat, searching for the crack in her armor. He found nothing but cold distilled focus. Get back to work, he grunted, turning into the snow. The next 2 years were a blur of high-G simulators, pressure chamber tests, and exhausting night tactical operations. While her peers slept during the brief rest cycles, Diana studied aeronautical engineering schematics by the dim light of a red tactical flashlight. She learned the anatomy of helicopters and jets, not just as a pilot, but as an engineer. She memorized every hydraulic line, every electrical relay, and every structural limit of the machines she commanded. In the high-altitude pressure chambers where trainees were subjected to controlled hypoxia to recognize their own cognitive decline, the other candidates began to slur their words and panic as their brains starved for oxygen. Diana remained locked in. She watched her fingernails turn a deep hypoxic blue, her hand steady on the controls, her mind calmly calculating the seconds of useful consciousness left to her. She had lived in an oxygen-deprived emotional environment her entire life. A physical chamber could not break her. By the autumn of 2024, the civilian world had completely forgotten the name Diana Vance. which was exactly how the United States Special Operations Command preferred it. She had been absorbed into the black budget, a shadow realm of military aviation, where aircraft carried no identifying flags, operations had no public records, and pilots were ghosts flying through contested skies. The forward operating base in the frozen bogs of the Arctic Circle was shrouded in an eternal heavy twilight. The temperature hung at 40 below zero. Inside the Tactical Operations Center, a single satellite screen blinked with a flashing red distress signal.
"We have a catastrophic compromise,"
the colonel announced, pointing to a jagged ridge deep inside a hostile northern territory. An elite intelligence gathering team was ambushed during a covert asset recovery. They are pinned down in a frozen marshland, completely surrounded by a heavily armed insurgent force equipped with shoulder-fired anti-aircraft missiles. The weather is a total blackout thermal inversion, zero visibility wind shear, exceeding 80 knots. No conventional asset can survive the approach. The colonel looked around the room at the gathered special operations pilots. "This is a zero visibility, low-altitude extraction. If you are shot down, there is no rescue team coming for you. The government will deny your existence." Diana stepped forward into the harsh blue light of the projector screen. Her flight suit was worn stained with grease and hydraulic fluid, her face lean and hardened by years of operational pressure. "I'm primary on the MH-60M, sir. I'll go." 40 minutes later, Diana was flying mere feet above the jagged, snow-covered treetops, her night vision goggles painting the world in an eerie, monochromatic green. The modified stealth Black Hawk vibrated violently as it slammed into the severe wind shears bouncing off the Arctic ridges. The controls fought her like a living animal trying to rip the collective from her grip.
"Missile launch, 9 o'clock!"
Her co-pilot screamed over the internal comms as the radar warning receiver erupted into a frantic, high-pitched wail. A shoulder-fired surface-to-air missile tore through the fog, drawn to the faint heat signature of the exhaust. Diana threw the heavy helicopter into a violent negative-G dive, dropping the aircraft into the shadow of a frozen ravine. The missile missed a direct strike, but detonated close enough to send a massive wave of shrapnel tearing through the tail section. The anti-torque system shattered. The tail rotor exploded into fragments, and the cockpit instantly lit up with a terrifying array of emergency red lights as hydraulic fluid sprayed across the engine compartments.
"We've lost the tail rotor. We're entering a catastrophic spin."
The co-pilot panicked, his hands freezing on the controls.
"I have the aircraft,"
Diana ordered, her voice cutting through the panic like a blade. Instead of fighting the spin, she used the main rotor's torque and the high winds to slam the helicopter forward, executing a dangerous high-speed running landing across the frozen bog, skidding violently through the mud and ice right into the perimeter of the pinned-down intelligence team.
"Load them up now, now!"
she shouted through the radio. Small arms fire peppered the armored belly of the helicopter as the wounded intelligence officers scrambled through the cabin doors. With the tail system completely disabled, Diana did the impossible. She balanced the aircraft on a knife edge of aerodynamic performance, using forward airspeed to compensate for the missing tail rotor, lifting the burning broken machine off the ice and forcing it back into the sky. She flew 300 miles back to base by sheer muscle memory and engineering intuition, landing the smoking wreck on the home tarmac just as the main transmission seized completely. 3 weeks later, in a windowless room at the Pentagon, a 4-star general pinned the Air Force Cross, the nation's second highest military decoration for extraordinary heroism, onto her uniform.
"This medal does not exist, Captain Vance,"
the general said quietly.
"Your file is locked under a black budget matrix code 14DOCX.
Officially, you were sitting at a desk in Washington checking inventory lists during this deployment." Diana looked down at the beautiful heavy metal before it was placed back into a secure velvet box.
"The record doesn't need to see it, sir.
I know what happened out there. 10,000 miles away from the frozen Arctic bogs, the afternoon sun warmed the manicured gardens of the Hampton Country Club. Eleanor Vance sat at a shaded table, her silk scarf fluttering gently in the ocean breeze as she turned the pages of a luxury real estate magazine. Cassandra sat across from her wearing a designer business suit, her fingers typing rapidly on a gold-plated smartphone as she reviewed the upcoming acquisition proposals for Vance Global Avionics. "Mother," Cassandra murmured without looking up from her screen. "Did you ever follow up on what happened to Diana? Someone from the corporate registry mentioned she was stationed near D.C. now." Eleanor took a slow, delicate sip of her iced tea, her face displaying a faint, amused condescension. "Please, Cassandra, let us not waste our energy discussing your sister's spectacular lack of ambition. Your father's legal team ran a routine background check on her last month just to ensure her military status wouldn't interfere with our corporate tax restructurings." "And what is she doing?" Cassandra asked, a small, arrogant smirk touching her lips. "Exactly what I predicted the night she left," Eleanor said, laughing softly. "She's a low-level desk clerk at a logistics depot in Washington, a glorified parts counter. She spends her days filling out requisitions for electronic components, sorting paperwork, and counting screws in a dusty warehouse for $40,000 a year. She lives in a microscopic apartment and hasn't corporate standing whatsoever." Eleanor leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with the absolute validation of a woman who believed her word was law. "She chose to be a servant rather than a ruler, Cassandra. She didn't have the intellect to handle the weight of global capital, so she went to a place where they tell her when to eat and what to wear. She is a non-entity, a complete waste of the Vance bloodline. I suppose someone has to count the screws," Cassandra scoffed, turning her attention back to her corporate acquisitions, completely dismissing her sister's existence from her mind. Meanwhile, across the Potomac River, inside a secure, high-clearance hangar that did not appear on any public map of Washington, Captain Diana Vance pulled her flight helmet over her head. She climbed up the boarding ladder of a next-generation stealth transport, its sleek composite skin absorbing the ambient lights of the facility. She settled into the pilot's seat, the advanced digital cockpit arrays initializing in a silent green glow around her. She had no corporate shares, no inheritance, and no place at her mother's table. But as she brought the massive engines to life, feeling the raw, terrifying power of 40,000 pounds of thrust vibrating through her spine, Diana looked out into the open sky. They owned the ledgers. She owned the horizon. And the reckoning was already on its way. The VIP conference room, known globally among elite defense contractors as the Zenith Vault, hung like a suspended shard of dark obsidian 60 stories above the rain-slicked pavement of Manhattan. The room was an architectural masterpiece of cold power lined with acoustic dampening paneling, soundproof smart glass that could deflect laser microphones, and an air filtration system that kept the temperature at a rigid, unforgiving 68 degrees. It smelled faintly of expensive white orchids and the synthetic crispness of high-end corporate insulation. On the far side of the monolithic quartzite conference table sat the unholy trinity of the Vance oligarchy. Eleanor Vance occupied the central high-backed leather throne, her posture as sharp and unyielding as a diamond stylus. To her right sat Arthur Vance, the patriarch, whose public reputation as a grandfatherly philanthropist masked a private life dedicated to the ruthless liquidation of weaker competitors. To her left sat Cassandra, the anointed corporate heir, her long manicured fingers lazily twirling a crystal goblet of a rare 1945 Bordeaux. Flanking them like a sleek predatory shark in a bespoke three-piece suit was Richard Lawson, the senior partner of Lawson & Associates, a corporate legal firm notorious for burying federal bodies so deep that not even a congressional subpoena could unearth them. The heavy double-frosted glass doors slid open with a soft pneumatic hiss. Diana Vance stepped into the vault. She did not walk. She marched. The transition from the high-stress cockpit of a tactical transport to the suffocating luxury of the Zenith Vault had taken less than 90 minutes, and the physical reality of her true life was written directly into her clothing. She wore her formal Air Force service dress uniform, the deep midnight blue wool pristine, the gold-threaded trim on her cuffs catching the recessed LED lights. Her chest was a dense, multicolored tapestry of ribbons, a grid of operational service low-altitude tactical hours, and classified campaign badges that few in the regular military could even identify. But it was her footwear that shattered the room's carefully curated elegance. Her combat boots were not polished to a mirror shine. They were sallow-weathered and heavy, their rugged Vibram soles caked with the dried, briny mud of a remote deployment zone and stained with a dark, oily smudge of JP-8 aviation fuel from her pre-flight walk-around. Every step she took across the plush, deep-pile Persian carpet left a faint gray ghost of a footprint. It was a silent, violent intrusion of real-world dirt into a kingdom built entirely on clean digital ledger entries.
Good God, Diana!
Eleanor sighed, pinching the bridge of her nose with a diamond-encrusted hand, her face contorting into an expression of profound disgust. Did you stop to dig a trench on your way to an emergency legal mediation? You look like a field laborer. I was flying an active mission, Mother, Diana said, her voice dropping into the quiet, controlled cadence of an officer on a flight deck. She did not sit in the empty chair left for her. She stood at the foot of the table, her hands clasped loosely behind her back.
Flying a mission!
Cassandra scoffed, her voice dripping with high society malice. She leaned back, swirling her dark wine.
Let's be realistic, Diana.
You mean you were sitting in some cramped logistics depot in Washington checking shipping manifests for uniform belts and counting spare electronic parts? Look at you. You've been away for years and you still smell like a mechanic's garage. Richard Lawson cleared his throat, a dry academic sound that instantly focused the room's energy. He adjusted his gold-rimmed spectacles and opened a thick leather-bound portfolio. Let us skip the familial pleasantries. We are here under an emergency financial mediation clause. Captain Vance, your family has been exceptionally patient in allowing you to retain your private government hobby without corporate interference. However, macroeconomic shifts require immediate asset rebalancing. Diana's eyes didn't waver from Lawson's face. Rebalancing? That's a very clean word for a corporate shakedown, Richard. Lawson leaned forward, his hands interlocking over the quartzite table. Let's look at the reality of your situation, Captain. While the Vance Group has been navigating the volatile waters of federal defense logistics, keeping thousands of American workers employed, you have been hoarded away in Washington. You draw a premium officer's salary, receive specialized hazardous duty stipends, and maintain a high-level security clearance that frankly should be serving the commercial interests of this family. My security clearance belongs to the United States Air Force, not Vance Global Avionics, Diana stated coldly. It's the same ecosystem, Diana, Arthur Vance barked, his first contribution to the meeting coming down like a hammer strike. He adjusted his silk tie, his face darkening with a familiar patriarchal rage. We operate the heavy transport networks that move federal assets. Your sister is currently structuring a multi-billion-dollar liquidity bridge for defense contractors. And what are you doing? You're counting screws. You're checking off serial numbers on crates of obsolete aircraft parts hiding behind government immunity while your sister carries the weight of this family's legacy on her shoulders. Cassandra smiled a thin, ugly line. She picked up a stack of legal documents, the deed of transfer for the Newport Research Center, a premium piece of commercial aerospace infrastructure worth $80 million that Diana had legally inherited through a grandfather's legacy trust.
You don't need Newport, Diana.
Cassandra said, rising from her seat and walking toward the end of the table where Diana stood. What does a desk clerk need with a triple-hangar private airfield and research hub in Rhode Island? The weight of this world rests on those of us who manage the flow of federal defense funds like myself. The real players need that infrastructure to grease the wheels of the new transport contract. Cassandra stopped right in front of Diana. With a deliberate, agonizingly slow tilt of her wrist, she leaned over the legal documents. The dark, blood-red Bordeaux poured directly over the top page of the Newport transfer contract, soaking the legal text in expensive alcohol before splashing down onto the tips of Diana's mud-stained combat boots. "Oops," Cassandra whispered, her eyes dancing with venomous joy. "My hand slipped. But it doesn't matter, does it? You'll sign the clean copy anyway. Consider it an installment payment for the 15 years you spent eating our food, sleeping under our roof, and contributing absolutely nothing to the bottom line." Diana looked down at the dark, wet stains spreading across her boots. She didn't flinch. She didn't draw back her fist. She didn't even blink. Deep within her chest, her heart rate began to climb towards 75 beats per minute as her adrenaline surged. Tactical breathing, she reminded herself. Inhale for 4. Hold for 4. Exhale for 4. Hold for 4. She drew the cool, orchid-scented air into her lungs. The world slowed down. The ticking of the wall clock became a distant, muffled thud. Her heart rate pulled back, locking into a flat, unyielding 60 beats per minute. A perfect combat-ready baseline. She looked up at her sister, her eyes completely vacant of fear. "You missed a spot," Diana said softly. Richard Lawson didn't wait for Cassandra to return to her seat. He reached into his briefcase and produced a secondary folder, slinging it across the quartzite table. It slid with a sharp zip before stopping right against Diana's knuckles. "If appeals to family solidarity won't move you, Captain, perhaps raw data will," Lawson said, a predatory smirk breaking across his features. "We have compiled a comprehensive ledger. Call it an itemized invoice for services rendered from the years 2006 through 2021. Diana flicked the folder open with one finger. The pages were filled with columns of numbers, dates, and official corporate seals. It wasn't a standard accounting ledger. It was a meticulously detailed list of every expense ever incurred during her upbringing. Line item 184, Advanced Pediatric Medical Care, 2009, $18,500. Line item 412, Private Primary School Tuition Differentials, $95,000. Line item 719, Private Security Allocation during European Travel, $45,000. Line item 921, Cost of Food, Shelter, and Seasonal Wardrobe, 2015 to 2018, $142,000. The grand total at the bottom of the final page was printed in bold red ink, $2,854,210. Every glass of water you drank, every coat you wore, every hour of tutoring you received to keep your mediocre grades acceptable was paid for by corporate distributions from Vance Global. Eleanor said, her voice cutting through the room like a razor blade. "You want to live this independent warrior woman fantasy, fine, but you will pay your debts first. You have used our capital to build your little life in Washington. Now we are calling the loan." Arthur leaned forward, his hands slamming down flat against the table, the heavy gold signet ring on his finger cracking against the stone. "You are going to sign that Newport transfer right now, Diana. If you don't, this packet doesn't just stay in this room. We have 3 major defense trade publications ready to run a feature on the parasite officer of the Air Force. A detailed expose on how a high-ranking logistics captain used her family's wealth to purchase her position while refusing to reimburse them for her basic upbringing. It would be a shame for your commanding officers to see what an ungrateful, unstable liability you are."
Eleanor added, her eyes narrowing. We've already prepared the medical affidavits, Diana. We have psychologists on our corporate payroll who are more than willing to provide a historical assessment suggesting you suffered from severe emotional instability prior to your enlistment. We will destroy your security clearance before the weekend. The threat hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. In the corporate military landscape, a loss of security clearance due to mental instability wasn't just a career ender. It was a total erasure of identity. They were offering her an ultimatum: give up her grandfather's legacy or lose the sky forever. Diana stood perfectly still, her hands still crossed behind her back, her breath moving in that slow, rhythmic 4-count rhythm. Inhale, hold. Exhale, hold. Her heart rate remained a flat line at 60. She looked at her mother. She looked at her father. She looked at her sister, who was currently smirking as she used a linen napkin to dab at the wine on the table. They thought they were playing corporate hardball. They thought they were holding all the cards because they had a high-priced lawyer and a pile of fake invoices. They truly believed she was just a paper pusher from Washington who could be bullied into submission by the threat of a public relations scandal. They had no idea who she actually was. "Is that everything?" Diana asked. Her voice was remarkably calm, almost conversational. Richard Lawson frowned, slightly unnerved by her complete lack of an emotional reaction. "That is the current terms of the settlement. Sign the Newport transfer and the invoice is cleared. The medical records remain sealed, and you can go back to your desk in Washington with your clearance intact." Diana slowly brought her hands forward from behind her back. She didn't reach for the pen Lawson had placed on the table. Instead, she reached into the high collar of her service dress uniform and pulled out a small black lanyard. Attached to it was a dual-encrypted biometric thumb drive, its casing stamped with the seal of the Defense Intelligence Agency, DIA, and a bright red classification sticker, top secret //SCI//no forn. She placed the drive on top of the wet, wine-soaked contract. "What is that?" Arthur growled. "We don't need your government files, Diana." "You should look closer, Father," Diana said, leaning over the table just enough to bring her face into the light. "You see, you're entirely correct about one thing. I do work in logistics allocation, but you missed the department code on my assignment profile." She tapped the drive. "I don't count screws for regular supply lines. I oversee the logistics compliance audits for black budget operational procurement. That means every private transport contractor wishing to bid on federal defense contracts has to pass through my office's financial screening matrix." The room went dead silent. The smirk on Cassandra's face began to falter. "For the past 18 months, Vance Global Avionics has been bidding on the new North Atlantic Transport Corridor contract." Diana continued, her voice cold and methodical, like a machine reading out a system failure log. "To qualify, your corporate group had to submit verified financial statements proving your liquidity and asset distribution. Do you know what my team found when we cross-referenced your submissions with the DIA database?" She looked directly at her mother. "We found that the Vance Group has been inflating its asset valuation by exactly $80 million, the projected value of the Newport Research Center. An asset you didn't legally own but flagged as corporate collateral anyway to secure an emergency credit line from a Wall Street syndicate." Richard Lawson's face drained of color. He stood up so fast his chair screeched against the floor. "This mediation is over. Captain Vance, you are in flagrant violation of—" "Sit down, Richard," Diana barked. The sheer authority in her voice, the voice of a pilot who had commanded burning aircraft through anti-aircraft fire, slammed into the lawyer like a physical blow. He sat back down, his mouth open but silent. "You brought federal delegates to this building today to witness my humiliation.
Diana said, a slow, dangerous smile finally touching her lips. But those aren't your delegates outside the door, Mother. Those are compliance officers from the Defense Contract Audit Agency and federal marshals from the Department of Justice. She leaned in her eyes, locking onto Eleanor's frozen gaze. You wanted to talk about invoices. This folder you gave me is an admission of corporate fraud. You've itemized personal expenses and attempted to extort a serving military officer using falsified corporate ledgers to cover a shortfall in your federal bidding compliance documents. That's a felony. Actually, it's 3 separate felonies. The pneumatic doors behind Diana slid open once more. This time, it wasn't a waiter with fresh wine. 2 men in dark suits with gold federal badges pinned to their lapels stepped into the room accompanied by a pair of Air Force Security Forces airmen in full tactical gear.
Eleanor Vance, Arthur Vance, and Cassandra Vance.
The lead federal agent announced, pulling a set of documents from his coat. You are under corporate asset freeze pending a formal investigation into defense procurement fraud and attempted extortion of federal personnel. Cassandra dropped her wine glass. It shattered against the quartzite table, the remaining liquid pooling around her designer skirt.
Mother, do something. She's lying. She's just a clerk. Eleanor didn't move. She couldn't.
For the first time in her life, she looked at her youngest daughter and didn't see an asset or a liability. She saw a predator. Diana picked up her thumb drive, wiping a drop of spilled wine off the encrypted casing before slipping it back into her pocket. She looked down at the family that had discarded her like trash in a winter storm years ago. The weight of the world doesn't belong to the people who move capital Cassandra, Diana said softly, adjusting her service cap as she turned toward the exit. It belongs to the people who keep it from falling. Enjoy the audit. She marched out of the Zenith vault, her heavy mud-stained boots leaving a permanent trail of defiance on the pristine carpet behind her. The atmosphere inside the Federal Adjudication Theater of the Department of Defense Procurement Oversight Division did not resemble a conventional courtroom. It was a sterile, soundproof amphitheater lined with brushed steel plates and acoustic obsidian panels designed to isolate the proceedings from the outside world. Here there were no public spectators, no cameras, and no dramatic gallery gasps. The fates of multi-billion-dollar military contracts and the freedom of corporate dynasties were determined in absolute classified silence. At the elevated center podium sat Federal Judge Harold Sterling. A veteran of both the military judiciary and supreme federal litigation, Sterling was a man whose face seemed permanently cast in iron. For 40 years, he had watched the greediest corners of the American military-industrial complex try to bleed the government dry. He was entirely immune to corporate theatrics. To his left, Eleanor Arthur and Cassandra Vance sat trapped behind a secured defense table flanked by federal marshals. Richard Lawson stood beside them, his forehead glistening with a fine sheen of cold sweat, his legal briefcases laying open like disemboweled beasts. Across the aisle, Diana Vance sat alone. She didn't have a team of silver-tongued corporate lawyers. She only had a singular, severe-looking military advocate in an Army service uniform and a heavy matte black secure terminal sitting between them. We are here to review the emergency injunction regarding the asset freeze of Vance Cybernetics Global. Judge Sterling announced, his voice a gravelly baritone that echoed off the obsidian walls. He didn't look at the Vance family. He didn't look at Diana. His focus was entirely on a thick lead-lined document portfolio that had just been delivered by a high-security courier. The portfolio was stamped with a double band of infrared security tape and bore the highest operational classification marker available to the federal government, Mark 10//classified compliance / Protocol D OCX.
Your Honor,
Richard Lawson stammered, stepping forward, his voice cracking slightly.
My clients maintain that the asset freeze is a gross abuse of power orchestrated by a low-level logistics officer using personal vendettas to subvert an essential national defense supply chain. The Vance group is vital to the quiet Mr. Lawson, Judge Sterling cut him off without looking up. With a specialized cryptographic keycard, Sterling broke the infrared seal on the portfolio. He opened the file labeled DOCX. For the first few seconds, Sterling's expression remained indifferent, the practiced mask of a seasoned judge. But as his eyes scanned the primary stencils, the unique deep purple digital security watermarks that only existed within the black budget command structure, his hands froze. His eyes widened. The iron mask shattered. Sterling looked down at the supreme electronic signature embedded at the bottom of the first 5 directives. It wasn't the signature of a warehouse clerk. It was an apex-level Department of Defense authorization code backed by an operational tier so high it technically bypassed congressional oversight during active warfare. The judge's gaze slowly drifted away from the paperwork. He looked across the courtroom, his eyes locking onto Diana Vance. The indifference was gone, replaced by a profound, raw shock that bordered on absolute reverence. Slowly, deliberately, the federal judge stood up from his bench. He didn't call for order. He didn't address the attorneys. Instead, he stepped out from behind the high mahogany podium. He stood at absolute attention, his spine snapping straight with the flawless precision of an old soldier, and raised his right hand to his brow, executing a perfect, unwavering military salute directly toward Diana. The courtroom froze. The air itself seemed to solidify. Eleanor Vance's mouth fell open in a silent, horrified gasp. Cassandra gripped the edge of the table so hard her manicured nails clicked violently against the wood. A federal judge, a man who answered only to the Constitution, was saluting their discarded, worthless daughter. Diana remained seated for a beat, then smoothly rose to her feet. She returned the salute with a single crisp movement. "At ease, Judge Sterling," Diana said softly. Sterling lowered his hand, his voice thick with an emotion he could barely contain. "The court recognizes the presence of supreme authority. God help me. I didn't know it was you." "Your Honor!" Eleanor Vance shouted, her aristocratic composure completely evaporating as she slammed her palms onto the defense table. "What is the meaning of this? This is an administrative hearing for a rogue employee. Why are you showing deference to a girl who counts electronic parts in a warehouse?" Judge Sterling returned to his seat, but the coldness in his eyes when he looked at Eleanor was lethal. "Silence, Mrs. Vance. If you speak out of turn again, I will have the marshals remove you to a holding cell beneath this facility. You have no understanding of the room you are currently standing in." He turned his eyes back to the DOCX file. "Mr. Lawson, you claim your clients are the victims of financial extortion by a parasite relative. Let us look at what File DOCX actually records." Diana's military advocate, Major Vance Avery, stepped forward and tapped a command on the secure terminal. The massive projector screens on the obsidian walls flickered to life, illuminating the dark room with rows of cold, unyielding financial transaction ledgers. "Let the record reflect the verified financial audit of the Black Budget Tactical Allowance Fund under the direct authority of the operational commander," Major Avery announced. The screen zoomed into a ledger dated December 2021. "In the winter of 2021, Major Avery stated, his voice echoing with a flat, rhythmic weight, Vance Cybernetics was facing a quiet, fatal liquidation. The Internal Revenue Service had prepared a public seizure warrant for the primary Vance estate and 40% of its domestic operating liquidities due to a $50,000 federal tax fraud discrepancy engineered by the chief financial officer, Eleanor Vance." Eleanor went entirely pale, her hands trembling against her tailored suit.
The public execution of that warrant would have destroyed the family's credit rating and disqualified them from federal bidding permanently. Avery continued. The warrant was never executed. Why? Because an anonymous wire transfer of exactly $50,000 arrived 48 hours before the seizure. That money did not come from a corporate bank. It came from a hazardous duty battlefield stipend earned by Captain Diana Vance during a low-altitude deployment in a hostile theater. She bled in a cockpit so her mother wouldn't have her mansion taken on the nightly news.
That's a fabrication,
Arthur Vance stammered, his voice losing its booming patriarchal authority, becoming thin and hollow. We never asked for her money.
You didn't have to,
Diana said from her seat, her voice cutting through his denial like dry winter grass catching fire. You were too busy looking at your own spreadsheets to notice the wolf at the door. I didn't do it for you, Father. I did it because the Vance name was attached to my uniform, and I refused to let your financial sloppiness compromise my operational status. Major Avery tapped the console again. The screen shifted to 2023. In July of 2023, Avery read aloud, Cassandra Vance was investigated by the Ohio Department of Commerce for a commercial fraud discrepancy involving the illegal diversion of state-subsidized infrastructure. The fine to settle the civil liability without a criminal indictment was $300,000. The money was paid within 12 hours from a military honor trust fund, a fund established for specialized tactical flight personnel who waive their right to public disability claims. Diana looked directly at her sister. Cassandra shrank back into her chair, the malicious smirk she had worn in the Zenith vault entirely gone, replaced by the terrified, frantic expression of a child caught stealing.
You called me an expense, Cassandra.
Diana said, her tone devoid of anger, which made it infinitely more terrifying. It was the tone of a judge reading a foreclosure notice. You drank $60,000 wine while I was paying off your fraud penalties with the skin off my knuckles. Every luxury you used to mock me was bought with the blood you thought I was wasting. The silence in the amphitheater was so heavy that the hum of the cooling fans inside the secure terminal sounded like a jet engine. Richard Lawson looked at the screens, then at the DOCX file, and slowly closed his portfolio. He was a corporate shark, but he knew when he was swimming in waters filled with naval mines. He quietly stepped away from the Vance family, signaling a silent professional abandonment.
But that is old history,
Judge Sterling said, his voice dropping into a register that made Arthur Vance's heart skip a beat.
Let us look at why File Docs was actually open this morning. Let us look at the current contract proposal for Vance Cybernetics Global.
The screens shifted one final time. The elegant corporate branding of the Vance Group appeared on the left, but it was immediately overlaid with a massive crimson digital stamp. Treason Directive / security breach / D CIS investigation CR-995. Cassandra Vance. Judge Sterling read from the file, as the newly appointed executive chair of Vance Cybernetics Global, you submitted a collateral guarantee using the Newport Research Center to secure a multi-billion-dollar federal contract for the supply of high-grade microchips for the next-generation security fleet. Is that correct? Yes, Cassandra whispered, her voice barely audible. It's a standard procurement bid. It would have saved our logistics division.
The microchip shipments you sourced.
Judge Sterling continued, his hand tightening on the edge of the paper until the leather of his glove creaked, were certified through a secondary supplier. But according to the Defense Criminal Investigative Service forensic lab results detailed in Section 4 of this document, those chips are not military-grade hardware. The screen displayed a molecular breakdown graph. The lines were jagged, unstable, flashing in warning yellows and reds.
They are counterfeit low-grade components prone to total system failure under extreme thermal strain. Sterling said, his voice rising with a terrible righteous fury. They are designed to pass superficial testing, but they suffer from catastrophic operational fatigue when exposed to real-world deployment pressures. If those chips had been integrated into the active fleet, dozens of tactical communication systems would have gone dark simultaneously. You didn't just cut corners, you commercialized treason.
Arthur Vance slumped forward, his head in his hands.
We didn't know. The supplier guaranteed the specifications. We were just trying to lower the production overhead to meet the federal cost cap. You were cutting corners on the lives of operators to protect your profit margin for the Wall Street merger, Diana said. She stood up, walking slowly toward the center of the room. Her sallow, oil-stained combat boots sounded like thunder against the metal floor panels. You thought you were operating in the shadows of the free market. Diana continued, looking down at her mother, who was now staring at her with wide, uncomprehending horror. You thought that by taking Newport, you could hide the asset inflation and use the federal advance capital to buy real components before anyone noticed the dummy shipments. You thought you were the ones running the Matrix.
Diana, please,
Eleanor whispered, her voice breaking the cold aristocrat finally cracking down to the bone.
We are your family. We are your blood. We can fix this. We can restructure the board. You can have Cassandra's seat. You can have the presidency.
You still don't get it, Mother, Diana said, stopping right before them.
You never did. You can't offer me a seat at a table that I have already broken.
Judge Sterling turned to the final page of File Docs. The digital watermark there wasn't a standard stamp. It was an active, rotating biometric cipher that required a live confirmation.
The authority required to issue a total non-appealable network lockout, permanent contract debarment, and corporate asset liquidation under a national security treason directive is reserved exclusively for the commander of the Black Budget Operations Command, Judge Sterling announced. He looked at Diana, his expression a mixture of awe and profound gratitude. Captain Diana Vance, Sterling said. Or should I address you by your supreme operational registry?
Major Avery stepped to the console and executed a final keystroke. The low-level logistics captain's profile on the screen dissolved. The old civilian records from the Vance estate vanished into a black hole of digital erasure. In their place appeared a full-dress military intelligence file. The image showed Diana, her face stern, her chest bearing not just ribbons, but the stars of a general officer's staff.
Let the record show,
Major Avery declared, that the individual known as Captain Diana Vance is a deep-cover tactical alias used for field-level asset validation. Her true rank, held under the Black Budget Defense Appropriations Act, is Major General Diana Vance, Director of the Special Operations Tactical Command.
Eleanor let out a choked, desperate sound, her hands clutching her throat as if she couldn't get enough air.
Cassandra began to weep openly, her head dropping onto the table, her designer suit soaking in her own tears. Arthur just stared at the floor, his spirit completely crushed under the weight of the stars on his daughter's true file.
General Vance,
Judge Sterling said, his voice softening into something deeply personal.
Before I execute your directive to seal this chamber and permanently terminate Vance Cybernetics Global, I must say something on the record.
Diana looked up at the bench. Go ahead, Judge.
My only son, the intelligence team leader, was the officer you pulled out of that frozen bog in the Arctic Circle in 2024,
Sterling said, a single tear slipping past his iron exterior.
He told me about the burning stealth helicopter. He told me about the pilot who defied the wind shear, who took shrapnel to the airframe and balanced that broken machine on a knife's edge until every single one of his men was out. He told me he never got to see her face because her mask was on and her file was locked under a black budget.
The old judge stood up once more, his hand trembling slightly as he looked at Diana.
"Thank you for my son's life, General."
Diana offered a small human nod, the only warmth she had shown since entering the room. He stayed cool under fire, Judge. He was worth the airframe. She turned her back on her family one last time. She didn't look at her mother's pale, pleading face. She didn't look at her father's broken shoulders. She didn't look at her sister's ruin.
"Execute the directive, Judge Sterling,"
Diana said as she walked toward the heavy steel exit doors.
"Lock down their networks. Freeze the assets. Wipe the Vance name off every federal ledger in this country."
With a firm, decisive stroke, Judge Sterling brought his electronic gavel down against the pad. Across the United States, every server belonging to Vance Cybernetics Global went black instantly. Every bank account was locked with a red federal seal. Every building was flagged for immediate asset forfeiture. The kingdom of ice and corporate vanity was liquidated in a single millisecond. Diana stepped out into the humid, rain-slicked air of the city, the heavy doors sealing shut behind her with the sound of a closing tomb. She looked up at the gray sky, the distant rumble of a military transport jet cutting through the clouds above. The ashes had settled. The matrix was exposed. And she was finally free. The heavy, definitive thud of Judge Sterling's electronic gavel colliding with the digital sensor pad did not just signify the administrative death of a corporate empire. It sounded like the structural detonation of a kinetic warhead within the pristine walls of the adjudication amphitheater. Richard Lawson, a man whose entire 25-year career on Wall Street had been built on smelling a federal ambush before the first shot was fired, felt the absolute air pressure in the room drop to zero. His predatory eyes darted frantically from the flashing red treason directive on the overhead obsidian screens to the stars of a general officer's staff now blazing on the unredacted military profile of Major General Diana Vance.
"Joint Special Operations Command."
His mind screamed in sheer, unadulterated terror. She isn't a logistics clerk. She is the shadow hand that commands the entire tactical black budget infrastructure. Lawson's hands began to shake, a violent, uncontrollable tremor that he tried to mask by sweeping his legal briefs into his alligator skin briefcase. He didn't just stand up. He practically threw his body away from the Vance defense table, physically divorcing himself from the people who had hired him. He knew the federal statutes down to the punctuation marks. Defending a corporate client in a contract dispute was lucrative. Being dragged into a Joint Special Operations Command investigation for manufacturing fraudulent evidence against a sitting two-star general was a one-way ticket to a maximum security federal penitentiary without the possibility of parole.
Mr. Lawson.
Eleanor Vance's voice was high, sharp, and laced with an uncharacteristic note of panic as she reached out to grab the sleeve of his tailored suit.
"What are you doing? Stand up and object. This is a kangaroo court.
She is using fabricated military intelligence to—"
"Do not touch me, Mrs. Vance!"
Lawson hissed violently, jerking his arm away from her manicured fingers as if her touch were radioactive. He didn't look at her. He couldn't look at her. His eyes were locked firmly on the floor, avoiding the piercing, Arctic blue gaze of the woman standing at the center of the room.
"Your Honor,"
Lawson stammered, turning toward Judge Sterling while completely backing away from his clients. Let the record reflect that Lawson and Associates was entirely unaware of the fraudulent sub-supplier documents submitted by Vance Cybernetics Global regarding the security fleet components. We were provided with falsified corporate ledgers by the Chief Financial Officer and Executive Chair. In light of these egregious undisclosed national security violations, my firm is withdrawing representation effective immediately.
"Lawson!"
Arthur Vance roared, his face turning a deep, dangerous shade of purple as his large frame bolted upright from his chair.
"We paid you a 7-figure retainer. You don't walk out on us. I am protecting my license, Arthur, and my freedom.
Lawson whispered, his voice cracking. He snapped the latches of his briefcase shut with 2 sharp metallic clicks. He didn't wait for Judge Sterling to grant him formal permission to leave. He didn't look back at the broken dynasty he was leaving behind. He turned on his heel and practically sprinted toward the rear exit, his leather shoes squeaking in a frantic, desperate rhythm against the polished steel floor panels until the heavy pneumatic doors swallowed him whole. The Vance family sat entirely alone behind the defense table. The high-priced armor of corporate legal defense had dissolved in less than 60 seconds, leaving them completely naked before the unyielding machinery of military justice. The space left by Lawson's flight didn't remain empty for long. The rear doors of the amphitheater slid open again with a heavy mechanical hum. 4 special agents from the Defense Criminal Investigative Service, DCIS, wearing tactical vests over their dark suits, their service badges gleaming under the stark LED lights, marched into the courtroom. They were flanked by a fire team of Air Force Security Forces airmen in full combat gear, their rifles held at a disciplined low-ready position. The lead DCIS agent, a stone-faced woman with her hair pulled into a tight, severe bun, carried a stack of red-bordered federal arrest warrants. She marched straight toward the Vance table, ignoring Arthur's towering stance and Eleanor's icy glare.
Cassandra Vance,
the agent announced, her voice echoing off the obsidian walls with the finality of a foreclosure notice. Under the authority of the Department of Defense and the United States District Court, you are under arrest for first-degree national defense procurement fraud conspiracy to commit treason and the deliberate sabotage of national security fleet assets.
No, this is a mistake,
Cassandra shrieked, her voice rising to a hysterical, glass-shattering pitch. She backed away from the table, her high heels catching on the legs of her chair, causing her to lose her balance. She collapsed heavily onto the cold, brushed steel floor panels, her designer skirt tearing along the seam, her immaculate blonde hair falling wildly across her face. "Mother, don't let them touch me! Make her stop it! Diana, tell them you're lying!" As an agent stepped forward and grabbed Cassandra's wrist, pulling her up from the floor, Arthur Vance completely lost his composure. The decades of absolute power he had wielded over his corporate fiefdom blinded him to the reality of the weapons in the room.
"Get your hands off my daughter!"
Arthur bellowed, lunging across the table, his heavy arms swinging out to strike the DCIS agent. He never made contact. Before his fist could clear the edge of the mahogany, 2 Air Force Security Forces airmen moved with explosive, lethal efficiency. One airman seized Arthur's extended arm, twisting it behind his back with a brutal, bone-snapping pivot, while the second airman drove his knee directly into Arthur's midsection. The air left Arthur's lungs in a loud, wet gasp as the massive patriarch was slammed face-first onto the quartzite table. A heavy black combat boot was driven into the small of his back, pinning him to the stone, while a set of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheted tightly around his thick wrists.
"Arthur!"
Eleanor screamed, her voice completely stripped of its aristocratic lacquer. She stood frozen at the center of the chaos, her hands clutched against her chest, her pale gray eyes moving from her husband pinned to the table to her eldest daughter, whose small wrists were currently being locked inside a pair of cold, unyielding iron cuffs. Click, click, click. The sound of the handcuffs locking into place on Cassandra's wrists seemed to echo directly in Eleanor's chest. She looked across the aisle at Diana. Diana hadn't moved an inch. She stood like a statue of midnight blue wool and gold braid, her face an unreadable mask of absolute terrifying calm. The daughter they had despised, the one they had called a line-item expense, a glorified warehouse clerk, and a parasite sitting in a dark corner of Washington, was the center of gravity around which the entire room was turning.
She wasn't just observing their destruction, she was the architect who had drawn the blueprints. The reality of her total, irreversible ruin finally broke through the final layers of Eleanor Vance's vanity. The Vance empire was gone. The bank accounts were frozen. Her husband was pinned under a soldier's boot, and her favorite child was being dragged toward a federal transport van in chains. With a low, desperate sob that sounded like dry paper tearing, Eleanor collapsed to her knees. She didn't care about the stains the floor might leave on her expensive Armani suit. She didn't care about the federal marshals watching. She crawled across the floor, her diamond rings scraping against the metal panels, until she reached the heavy, mud-stained tips of Diana's combat boots. "Diana, please." Eleanor wept her tears, smearing the heavy makeup on her wrinkled cheeks, her manicured fingers trembling as she tried to reach up and grasp the hem of her daughter's uniform trousers. "I beg of you, use your power. Call them off. You have the stars. You have the intelligence clearance. You can tell them it was an administrative misunderstanding. You can call the Pentagon and save Cassandra. She can't survive in a prison, Diana. She is your older sister. Please have mercy on your own blood." Diana looked down at the woman who had once thrown her scholarship and military orders into the burning coals of the estate fireplace without a single trace of remorse. She didn't draw her boots back, nor did she lean down to comfort her. Her eyes remained as cold and unyielding as the Arctic ice shelf she had flown over during the black budget missions of her youth. Slowly, deliberately, Diana reached up and adjusted the stiff, formal brim of her Air Force service cap, centering the gold-embroidered eagle and anchor insignia over her eyes. "I don't negotiate with corporate parasites and suit-wearing traitors, Mother," Diana said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it possessed a weight that silenced the remaining cries in the room. "For 18 years, you looked at me and saw nothing but a depreciating liability. You itemized my childhood down to the last dollar, tracking the cost of the food I ate and the roof over my head as if I were a thief in your house. You told me my only utility was to be sold off to a Wall Street syndicate to balance your corporate ledgers." She leaned down just enough so that her words were intended for Eleanor's ears alone. "You were wrong about the ledger, Eleanor. I was never your expense. I was the only asset this family ever had that couldn't be bought. And now the bill for your arrogance is due. Let's see how your capital handles the interest." Diana straightened her spine, turning her back on her mother's weeping form with a fluid military pivot. As she turned toward the heavy steel exit doors, a tall man in a dark, simple civilian jacket stepped out from the shadows near the security detail. It was Daniel, her husband, a city firefighter whose hands were calloused from real axes and wet hoses, a man who had stood silently at her back through every storm, never asking for her family's wealth and never flinching from her secret military rank. He didn't say a word. He just extended his hand, his fingers closing securely around hers, providing the only real warmth she had ever known. "Let's go home, General," Daniel said softly. Diana smiled beneath the shadow of her cap. "Let's." They walked out together, the heavy steel doors of the adjudication chamber sliding shut behind them, sealing the Vance dynasty into the dark archive of federal liquidation. 3 years later, the afternoon sun streamed through the massive glass pavilion of the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C., illuminating the polished aluminum hulls of legendary aircraft suspended from the ceiling like a fleet of metallic angels. The air was filled with the low, pleasant murmur of tourists, the laughter of children, and the faint scent of roasted coffee from the museum cafe. Diana walked slowly down the central gallery. She wasn't wearing her midnight blue service dress or her Major General's insignia. She wore a simple, elegant ivory trench coat, dark trousers, and low leather flats.
Her face was bright relaxed, the deep lines of stress that had once defined her jaw during the black budget years completely smoothed away by 36 months of absolute unburdened freedom. Clutched tightly in her right hand was the small warm palm of a 4-year-old girl. The child's name was Chloe. She had Cassandra's pale blue eyes and bright blonde curls, but none of the cold malice that had destroyed her mother. After the federal trials had concluded with Cassandra sentenced to 20 years in a maximum security facility and the Vance group completely dismantled by the asset forfeiture liquidation, Cassandra's high society husband had quietly vanished, abandoning the infant child to the state foster system to protect his own remaining assets. Diana hadn't hesitated. The day the adoption papers cleared, she had taken Chloe into her home, erasing the final remnants of the Vance cycle of abuse with a quiet, unconditional love. "Look, Auntie Di," Chloe squealed, pointing her small finger upward toward a massive matte black strategic bomber suspended directly above them. "That one looks like a giant bird." Diana stopped looking up at the sleek, aggressive lines of the legendary strategic airframe. "That's a very special plane, Chloe. It flies so high that the people on the ground can't see it, and it flies so fast that the storms can never catch it." "Did you ever fly one?" Chloe asked, her eyes wide with childhood wonder. Diana leaned down, lifting the little girl into her arms with an effortless, practiced strength. She tapped the child's small nose with her finger, her heart filling with a deep, pristine sense of peace that no corporate ledger or military promotion could ever provide. "A long time ago, sweetheart," Diana whispered, looking past the steel wings of the museum display toward the clear, bright blue sky, visible through the glass ceiling above. "But now, I'm done flying in the dark." She set Chloe back down onto the polished marble floor. The little girl laughed, turning to run toward the next display, her small shoes clicking in a bright, happy rhythm that held no echo of the past. Diana followed close behind her. Her hand slipped into Daniel's pocket as he walked beside her, her spirit entirely clean, entirely victorious, and finally completely free.
Every story teaches us something. Today's lesson is simple. Never judge someone's value by where they started. Judge them by what they overcame. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. See you in the next story.